Okay. You say that we are going to collapse into a Great Depression. How long before that? And what does that look like? To explain that to the average American and what that looks like.
Well, in Chapter 8 of my book, I try to be absolutely as scary as possible. It's called Disaster Scenarios. And I describe what a Great Depression would mean at home in the United States as well as globally. And so that's what we need to avoid at all cost. Now, the trick is, I think you're a follower of the Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, and they understood that when you create credit, it creates an artificial boom. And they also understood that the day always comes when the credit stops expanding. And at that point, then the prosperity created by the credit, well, it doesn't just flatten out at a very high level of prosperity. It then all spirals downward in reverse. And that is the Depression. So after a 45-year-long, $50 trillion credit-induced global boom, if we now permit the credit to stop expanding, then the depression that we have will be so severe. I mean, honestly, I don't think our civilization could survive it. It's not certain that democracy could survive that sort of crisis.
Wait, please expand, because when people say to me, Glenn, you believe the economy is going to collapse. I do. But they say, well, what does that mean? And I say, I don't think we survive. I don't know exactly even what I mean by that. Explain when you say, I don't think our civilization will survive. What do you mean by that?
Okay, well, let's say the banking system fails. That destroys everyone's savings overnight. So suddenly your ATM machine doesn't work, you have no cash, you've lost your job, and the government no longer has any tax income, so they can't provide you any welfare or Social Security or Medicare. And so people are beginning to starve, and the crime wave explodes. Meanwhile, they can't afford to maintain the military bases overseas, so all the soldiers come home, and we no longer have a global empire as we do at the moment. Global trade breaks down, and China's economy implodes because it's dependent on export-led growth to the U.S. That would stop. China's economy would implode. The geopolitical consequences of a collapse of global trade could very well lead to war, as the Depression led to World War II.
Give me a comparison to to the Depression in the 1930s to what it would be like here now.
Well, first of all, I think it's important and interesting to understand that these two crises have come about in the same way. The Great Depression originated, in my opinion, when World War I started. At that point, all the European nations went to war. They didn't have enough gold to fight the war. So they went off the gold standard and started printing a lot of paper money and issuing a lot of government debt.
And went to us.
And that created a worldwide credit boom that we call the Roaring Twenties. But in 1930, the credit couldn't be repaid, and the international banking system collapsed, and global finance collapsed, and international trade collapsed, and the U.S. collapsed into a Great Depression. GDP contracted by 46%, and unemployment ranged from 15% to 25% for 10 years until World War II started. And at that point, then U.S. government spending increased 900%, and that ended the Depression, but of course 60 million people died during the war. Now this time the pattern is exactly the same. This time the Bretton Woods system broke down in 1971. That was a kind of gold standard. Afterwards, the government started issuing enormous amounts of government debt and more paper money. This has created a 4-decade-long global boom, but in 2008, the credit couldn't be repaid, and the international banking system started to collapse, and global trade started to collapse. But this time, the governments have jumped in with a very aggressive policy response to prevent any sort of return to a market-determined equilibrium, because they fear that that kind of equilibrium would mean the economy would contract by a third or 40% relative to what it was in 2006. And they fear that we couldn't survive that.
All right, give me
so that determines the policy response.
Give me a real